A door does not creak like this anywhere else in the world. It is iron. It is old. And behind it, a boy sits in the dark, counting his own heartbeat because it is the only sound he trusts. Somewhere above him, torches gutter against stone walls slick with condensation. Somewhere below him, men speak a language he has only begun to understand, sharp and guttural, full of commands he must obey or die pretending to. The air smells of tallow smoke and boiled mutton and something else beneath it. Fear, his own, sweating into wool he has not changed in days. He is 11 years old. His name, in the tongue of his own people, means little dragon. Here, in this fortress at the edge of an empire that eats kingdoms the way other men eat bread, his name means nothing at all. Here he is a hostage, a guarantee, a piece of collateral breathing. Somewhere far to the north, his father wears a golden medallion shaped like a coiled serpent devouring its own tail, and calls himself a knight of Christ, sworn by sacred oath to defend the faith against the very empire that now holds his son in chains of silk rather than iron. Softer, but no less binding. The boy will remember this cell for the rest of his life. He will remember the smell of it in moments of triumph, and he will remember it in moments of horror he himself will manufacture, decades later, in forests that will make grown soldiers weep and turn back rather than walk another mile. He does not know that yet. Tonight, he only knows the dark, and the door, and the sound of men deciding his fate in a language built for command. Somewhere a jackal howls. Somewhere water drips. And somewhere inside that cold Ottoman fortress, something is beginning to harden inside the boy who will one day be called Vlad. The world will remember him by another name. Dracula. But before the name, before the legend, before the forest of the Impaled that would make even sultans hesitate, there was only this. A child, a cage, and an oath, broken so many times by so many men, that the boy would grow into someone who trusted almost no one, and forgave almost no one, ever again. This is the story of how a hostage became a monster, and how an empire, in trying to break a boy, built its own executioner. The 15th century did not forgive weakness. It barely tolerated mercy. Across the Carpathian Arc, where cold rivers carve through black forest and limestone gorge, a small principality clung to survival between two hungers. To the south, the Ottoman Empire, vast, disciplined, endlessly expanding, a machine of conquest fed by faith and by fear in equal measure. To the north and west, the Kingdom of Hungary, itself hungry, itself devout, itself willing to swallow smaller neighbors whole in the name of holy war. Wallachia sat between them like a lamb watching two wolves circle, each wolf convinced the other would strike first. This was a land of mud roads and wooden churches, of boyars, noble landowners, who changed loyalty as easily as changing horses, murdering princes in the night when it suited their purses. Princes here did not simply inherit thrones. They seized them, held them by knife edge, and lost them the same way. In the span of a single lifetime, Wallachia could burn through a dozen rulers, each one crowned in a chapel and buried in a ditch. Picture the capital at Targovist in winter, smoke rising from low timber houses, the smell of wood smoke and horse dung and boiled cabbage thick in narrow streets, church bells calling the faithful through air so cold it burned the lungs. Picture the boyars in their fur-lined coats, whispering in corners, counting which prince might soon need replacing. Picture the peasants, who paid for every war with grain, with sons, with blood, and asked for nothing in return but survival. And to the south, across the Danube, picture something almost incomprehensible in scale. Ottoman columns stretching for miles, the green banners of the Sultan snapping in wind carrying the scent of gunpowder and horse sweat, siege engines groaning toward the walls of Constantinople itself. This was an empire built on obedience so total that it took Christian boys from conquered lands, raised them as Muslim soldiers, and turned them into some of the most feared warriors on earth. The Janissaries, men without family, without past, loyal only to the Sultan who had unmade and remade them. It was into this world that a boy named Vlad was born, second son of a prince who wore the emblem of a dragon and had sworn, before God and before witnesses, to hold back the Ottoman tide forever. That oath would not survive contact with reality. Few oaths in Wallachia did. His father, Vlad II, had been inducted into the Order of the Dragon by the Holy Roman Emperor himself, a chivalric brotherhood dedicated to defending Christendom, its members bound by solemn vow to fight the infidel wherever he advanced. It was this order that gave the family its name, Dracula, the dragon, and in time, the diminutive form would follow the son like a shadow he could never outrun. Dracula, son of the dragon. But an oath sworn in a cathedral means little on a battlefield where survival depends on which empire you fear more on any given morning. Vlad II ruled a country too small to defy the Ottomans outright and too proud to submit entirely. So he did what desperate men in desperate places have always done. He bent. He paid tribute. And when the Sultan demanded proof of loyalty beyond gold and grain, Vlad II offered something far more valuable and far more dangerous to give away. He offered his sons. In the year 1442, the boy Vlad, perhaps 11 years old, his exact age lost to imprecise chronicles, was sent south across the Danube with his younger brother Radu, delivered into the household of Sultan Mehmed II as a living guarantee that their father would not break faith with the empire that could crush his tiny principality in a season. This was not imprisonment in the way modern minds imagine it. There were tutors. There was education in Arabic, in the Quran, in horsemanship, in the arts of war and statecraft that would one day make Vlad a dangerous and calculating ruler. But do not mistake comfort for kindness, and do not mistake education for safety. Every day the boy woke inside the empire that could execute him the moment his father's loyalty wavered. Every day he understood, with the terrible clarity children develop when their lives depend on it, that his own body was currency, a bargaining chip with a heartbeat. His brother Radu adapted. Younger, more pliable, some accounts suggest more favored within the Ottoman court, Radu would grow to love the empire that raised him, eventually converting fully to its cause, becoming in time a commander who fought for the Sultan against his own brother. Blood does not guarantee loyalty. Sometimes captivity teaches two brothers two entirely different lessons. Vlad learned something colder. He learned that oaths are instruments, not sacred bonds. He learned that mercy is a luxury only the powerful can afford to extend, and only when it serves them. He watched Ottoman justice carried out, swift, theatrical, designed to be witnessed and remembered, punishment as public performance meant to freeze the will of anyone who saw it. He watched impalement used as an instrument of political terror long before he ever ordered it himself, and some historians believe it was here, in this foreign court that raised him against his will, that the boy first learned the method that would one day make his own name a synonym for horror. Then, in 1447, everything changed. Word reached the boy in captivity that his father and his elder brother, Mircea, had been murdered back home, not by the Ottomans he had spent his life fearing, but by his own countrymen. Boyars, in league with Hungarian interests, had turned against Vlad II, deposed him, and killed him. Mircea, the elder son and heir, was reportedly captured, blinded, and buried alive by the very nobility meant to serve the crown he would have inherited. The Ottomans had held Vlad hostage as insurance against his father's betrayal. It was his own people who betrayed his father first. Sit with that for a moment. A boy raised in an enemy court to guarantee his father's loyalty, learning that the danger was never truly from outside the walls of his homeland. The danger had been waiting inside them the entire time. The empire that had caged him now became, strangely, useful to him. In 1448, with Ottoman military support, the teenage Vlad was placed briefly on the Wallachian throne, a puppet installed by the very power that had once held him hostage, ruling for barely 2 months before being driven out again by rival claimants backed by Hungary. He would spend the better part of the next decade in exile, in Moldavia, in Hungary itself, learning, watching, surviving in the households of men who might just as easily have had him killed as sheltered him. He served under commanders, studied the machinery of 2 rival empires from the inside, and waited. By 1456, Vlad was no longer a hostage. He was no longer a boy. He returned to Wallachia at the head of an army, reclaimed his father's throne by force, and began, almost immediately, to demonstrate to every boyar who had conspired against his family exactly what kind of prince a childhood of captivity, betrayal, and calculated cruelty had produced. The empire had tried to shape him into an instrument of Ottoman will. Instead, they had forged a weapon that would, for a time, terrify them more than any Christian army in Europe. To understand what Vlad became, you must first understand the machine he was born into, a machine built not on law, but on fear, obligation, and the constant threat of the knife in the dark. Wallachia's throne was never secure. The office of voivode, prince, was theoretically hereditary but practically elective, contested among rival branches of the ruling family, the Basarab dynasty, each claimant backed by different factions of boyars who switched allegiance with the seasons. A prince ruled only as long as he could outmaneuver, out-terrify, or outbribe the men whose support kept him breathing. This was the boyar system, a nobility whose wealth came from land and peasant labor, whose loyalty came from self-interest, and whose habit of assassinating inconvenient princes had claimed the lives of Vlad's own father and brother. To rule Wallachia was to rule a viper's nest, and the vipers had already proven they would strike at royal blood without hesitation. Beyond Wallachia's borders, two greater machines ground against each other, and against the small country caught between them. The Ottoman system was built on absolute submission to the Sultan, enforced through military discipline unmatched anywhere in Europe. Vassal states like Wallachia were required to pay an annual tribute in gold, to send young boys in a levy known as the Devshirm to be raised as Janissaries, and to provide military support when the Sultan called for it. Refusal meant invasion. Compliance meant slow strangulation of sovereignty, tribute increasing year after year until a state existed only at the pleasure of an empire that could erase it whenever convenient. The Hungarian system, meanwhile, operated under the banner of crusading Christendom, promising protection to Wallachia in exchange for loyalty, a promise that, time and again, evaporated the moment Hungarian interests shifted elsewhere. Hungary armed rival claimants to the Wallachian throne just as readily as it armed Vlad himself, playing every side against every other, because for the great powers, Wallachia was never an ally. It was a buffer, a shield to be spent. Vlad understood this machine intimately, because he had lived inside two of its gears, Ottoman captivity and Hungarian exile, before he ever sat upon its throne. He knew that boyars would betray him the moment weakness showed. He knew that Hungary's friendship lasted only as long as it served Hungary. He knew that Ottoman tribute, once paid, would only be demanded again, larger, the following year, in an endless cycle designed to bleed a small country until it had nothing left to resist with. So Vlad built something new. Not trust. Trust had killed his father. He built terror, engineered with the same precision the Ottomans had once used to terrify him. His first act as secured ruler was aimed inward, at the boyars who had murdered his family and destabilized every prince before him. Chronicles, many written decades later by his enemies, and treated by careful historians with appropriate caution, describe a purge so calculated it reads like theater. According to these accounts, Vlad invited the boyar families of Targovist to a grand Easter feast, welcomed them with wine and warmth, and then, without warning, ordered his soldiers to seize them. The elderly, the story goes, were impaled on the spot. The able-bodied were marched, some accounts say barefoot, some in chains, nearly 50 miles north to the ruins of Poenary, forced to rebuild a fortress on a cliff above the Argesh River, working until their clothes fell from their bodies in rags, until the noble hands that had once counted coin and conspired against princes were left bleeding and broken on stone. Whether every detail of this story survived intact through a century of hostile retelling, no historian can say with certainty. But the fortress at Poenary still stands today, a testament to something built in blood, real or embellished, that Wallachia never forgot. He replaced the old nobility with men loyal to him personally, some risen from lower ranks, bound to Vlad not by ancient privilege but by direct debt, men who understood that their position existed entirely because the prince allowed it, and could be revoked as easily as it was given. He rebuilt the machinery of the state around a single principle, one his childhood had taught him better than any tutor. Loyalty enforced by love is fragile. Loyalty enforced by terror endures. It would work, for a time, better than anyone expected. But every machine built on fear requires constant fuel, and the appetite Vlad was building would soon demand more than boyars. It would demand an empire's attention. The war did not begin with an army. It began with two men who refused to remove their hats. In 1459, Ottoman envoys arrived at Vlad's court to collect the annual tribute, a familiar ritual, one every Wallachian prince before him had performed with gritted teeth and lowered eyes. But something in Vlad had changed since the throne room of his childhood captivity. When the envoys, following their own custom, declined to remove their turbans in his presence, Vlad did not overlook the insult as his predecessors had. He asked why. They explained it was their custom, sacred, unbending. So Vlad, the story goes, ordered his men to nail the turbans to the envoys' skulls, to make their custom, as he reportedly said, even more firmly attached. Whether this exact exchange occurred as later chroniclers described it, the message underneath it was unmistakable and undeniable by anyone who heard the tale spread across two empires. Wallachia would no longer bow quietly. Then everything changed. Vlad stopped paying tribute. For a brief season, Vlad stood at the height of everything Wallachia had ever hoped a prince could be. He had done what his father never managed. He had made an empire retreat. Word of the campaign spread across Christian Europe like wildfire. Pamphlets printed in German cities carried woodcut illustrations of the forest of impaled bodies, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated for effect, turning Vlad simultaneously into a hero of Christendom and a figure of nightmare. In Rome, in Venice, in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, his name was spoken with something between admiration and dread. Here, finally, was a small Christian prince who had made the seemingly unstoppable Ottoman war machine hesitate. At home, his rule brought a strange and brutal order. Chronicles, again, largely hostile, largely written after his fall, and requiring careful skepticism, describe a Wallachia under Vlad where crime nearly vanished, where a golden cup, according to popular legend, could be left at a public well and remain untouched for years because the punishment for theft was so absolute, so theatrically final, that even desperate men chose starvation over risk. Merchants, the stories claim, could travel roads once plagued by bandits without fear because Vlad had turned fear itself into the law of the land and applied it without exception. Nobility and peasant alike could find themselves upon a stake for offenses that lesser princes overlooked. Whether this golden age of order is historical fact or propaganda polished by later storytellers who needed their monster to also be, in some twisted way, a great ruler, the truth likely sits somewhere between myth and memory. But the fear was real. The order, however brutal, was real. And for a time, it worked exactly as Vlad had designed it to. He held a border that far larger, far wealthier kingdoms had failed to hold. He humiliated an empire that had swallowed Constantinople itself. He ruled a nation of vipers and, for a handful of years, made even the vipers behave. This was the peak. The mountain's summit, however brief, however soaked in blood the path to reach it had been. But mountains have only one direction left to go once you reach the top. And the same methods that had built Vlad's power, the same terror, the same absolute unwillingness to trust, the same instinct to answer betrayal with annihilation, were already, quietly, becoming the instrument of his undoing. Power built entirely on fear carries a debt that eventually comes due. And Vlad's debt was compounding daily, in ways even he could not fully see from inside his own reign. Consider what it costs a man to trust no one. Consider what 11 years old, alone in a fortress cell, teaches a mind about the people meant to protect it. Vlad had learned, in the cruelest classroom imaginable, that fathers can be murdered by their own nobles, that brothers can be turned against you by the right empire's patience, that allies switch sides the moment the wind shifts. He carried that lesson into every relationship of his adult life, and it hollowed him even as it protected him. He trusted almost no one completely. Not the boyars he had replaced with men of his own choosing, not the Hungarian king who had once sheltered him in exile, not even, in the end, his own brother. because his own brother had become his enemy. Radu, the boy who had adapted to Ottoman captivity, who had grown comfortable inside the very court that Vlad had learned to hate, was now a grown man, a favorite of the new sultan's court, and increasingly positioned by the Ottomans as the more pliable, more useful alternative to his defiant older brother. Two sons of the same father, raised in the same cage, had emerged as opposites, one who had made peace with the empire and one who had made war against it. And now the empire intended to use the compliant brother to remove the defiant one. The paranoia this bred in Vlad was, by every surviving account, immense. He saw conspiracy in every boyar's hesitation, betrayal in every noble who had once served a rival claimant. His court became a place where accusation could end in execution with almost no distance between the two. Some historians estimate the death toll of his reign, through impalement, through burning, through mass execution of beggars, and the poor he reportedly gathered into a hall and burned alive rather than continue feeding them, may have reached tens of thousands, an almost incomprehensible figure for a principality of Wallachia's modest population. Whether every atrocity attributed to him is accurate, whether propaganda inflated numbers for political purposes by his enemies in Hungary and in the German pamphlets that turned him into Europe's favorite monster, the truth is unknowable in exact figures. But the pattern is not in dispute. A man raised inside an empire's machinery of terror had built his own machinery to match it, and by the mid-1460s, that machinery consumed nearly everyone around him, ally and enemy alike, with diminishing ability to tell the difference. He was, by every account, increasingly alone. A prince cannot rule through fear forever without eventually fearing everyone in return. And in 1462, the same year of his greatest triumph against the Ottomans, the walls Vlad had built around himself were about to close in from a direction he had least expected. Not from the Ottomans he had humiliated. From the Hungarian king he had once trusted enough to call an ally. The letters arrived first, and they were forgeries, though it would take centuries for historians to seriously consider that possibility, and by then, the damage was already permanent. In late 1462, Vlad sought refuge and support from Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary, hoping the Christian monarch would honor an alliance against the common Ottoman threat and provide troops to continue the resistance Vlad had fought so hard and so brutally to sustain. Instead, Corvinus produced letters, allegedly written by Vlad himself, suggesting the Wallachian prince intended to betray Hungary and switch allegiance back to the Ottoman Sultan. Modern historians largely regard these letters as fabrications, likely manufactured by Corvinus for a much simpler reason than any genuine fear of Vlad's loyalty. The Hungarian king had received funds from the Pope specifically earmarked for a crusade against the Ottomans, funds he had not actually used for that purpose. Accusing Vlad of treachery gave Corvinus a convenient excuse to avoid marching south himself, while still appearing to act decisively against a supposed traitor. Vlad, the man who had trusted almost no one his entire life, who had built an empire of terror specifically because he understood how easily loyalty could be manufactured and betrayed, was himself betrayed by a forged signature and a king's convenient excuse. He was arrested, imprisoned, and for roughly the next decade, the prince who had once made an Ottoman sultan turn back an entire army lived instead as a captive of the very Christian kingdom he had hoped would be his shield. Some accounts of his imprisonment describe relatively comfortable conditions in later years, even a marriage to a relative of the Hungarian royal family, a partial rehabilitation as Corvinus found new political use for him. But the years lost cannot be recovered, and the Wallachian throne Vlad had bled to secure was occupied, in his absence, first by his own brother Radu, ruling as an Ottoman client, and then by rival claimants who owed their positions to exactly the kind of boyar politics Vlad had once tried to burn out of existence. The machine that had made him, captivity, betrayal, calculated terror, had now turned fully against its own architect. He had learned these lessons as a hostage of the Ottomans. He relearned them, more bitterly, as a prisoner of the Hungarians. Every ally, it seemed, eventually became a cage. Every oath, eventually, broke. By 1476, More than a decade after his imprisonment began, political winds shifted once more. The Ottoman threat had grown too dangerous for Hungary and its allies to ignore, and Vlad, battle-tested, feared, and still useful as a weapon against the empire he had once escaped as a boy, was released, restored to a measure of favor, and given the chance to reclaim his throne one final time. He marched south with a small force, retook Wallachia, and for a brief moment it must have felt to him like his childhood cell, his years of exile, his decade of captivity had all led back to this single point, a circle finally closing, a prince returning to the throne that had cost him everything to hold even once. But this time there would be no forest of the Impaled to save him, no army large enough to make an empire hesitate, only a battlefield, a winter, and the ending that had been waiting for him since the moment a father sent his son south across a river as collateral for an oath that never held. The details of Vlad's final months on the throne and of his death exist in fragments, contradictions, and centuries of speculation that historians still argue over today. What is generally agreed upon is this: Vlad returned to power in Wallachia in November of 1476, backed by a modest force of Hungarian and Moldavian allies, reclaiming the throne from Ottoman-backed rivals who had ruled in his absence. But his position was fragile from the start, his army small, his support uncertain, the boyars who remembered his previous reign of terror unlikely to greet his return with anything resembling loyalty. Within weeks, possibly within 2 months of retaking his throne, Vlad was dead. The most widely accepted account places his death in battle, likely in late December 1476 or early January 1477, fighting near Bucharest against Ottoman forces or Ottoman allied Wallachian rivals. Accounts differ on the precise circumstances. Some chronicles suggest he was ambushed and killed by his own soldiers, mistaken in the chaos of battle for an enemy combatant, cut down by the very men meant to protect him. Other accounts claim he was betrayed and assassinated by boyars who had waited years for the opportunity his return provided. Still others describe a straightforward death in combat against superior Ottoman numbers, a prince who died as he had lived, with a blade in his hand rather than a crown of safety on his head. What happened next is where history dissolves fully into legend. Some accounts state that Vlad's head was severed from his body, preserved in honey to survive the journey, and sent to Constantinople as proof of his death, displayed, some stories claim, on a stake before the Sultan's court, a final and symmetrical horror for a man whose entire legend had been built on that very method of execution. Whether this occurred exactly as described remains unverified. What is beyond dispute is that no confirmed remains of Vlad III have ever been definitively identified. For centuries, popular tradition held that his body was buried at Snagov Monastery, an island retreat near his former capital, where an unmarked grave near the altar was long believed to hold the prince's remains. Excavations in the 20th century, however, found the grave largely empty, containing only animal bones and fragments unrelated to a body of Vlad's era, deepening rather than resolving the mystery. More recent research has pointed toward other possible burial sites, including speculation, still unconfirmed, connecting artifacts and remains to locations far from Snagov entirely. The prince who spent his childhood as a hostage, hidden inside an empire's fortress, ended his life with a body that history itself cannot locate. There is a symmetry to that which feels almost too precise for coincidence, and yet it is simply the truth, unresolved, the way so much of Vlad's life resists the clean narrative that legend later imposed upon it. A boy who disappeared into captivity, a man whose final resting place disappeared into myth. The empire survived. The man did not. But something of him did survive, twisted, exaggerated, and eventually immortalized in ways the historical Vlad could never have imagined, carried forward not by Wallachian chroniclers, but by a Victorian novelist half a world away and 4 centuries removed from the frozen fortress where an 11-year-old boy once counted his own heartbeat in the dark. Return, for a moment, to that cell. To the boy who did not yet have a legend attached to his name, who only had cold stone and the smell of tallow smoke, and the sound of men in a foreign language deciding whether his father's oath would hold long enough to keep him alive one more season. Everything that followed. The forest of impaled bodies stretching for miles along a Wallachian road. The boyars marched to their deaths, building a fortress on a cliff, the turbans nailed to skulls, the terror so complete that gold could sit untouched at a public well. All of it traces back to that cell. To a child who learned, far too young, that the people meant to protect you can be the ones who destroy you, and that oaths sworn before God mean nothing at all against ambition, fear, and convenience. Vlad was not born a monster. Empires do not manufacture monsters from nothing. They manufacture them from children, from hostages, from boys who watch power operate at its most naked and most cruel, and who decide, somewhere in the dark of a foreign cell, that they will never again be the one without a weapon in their hand. The tragedy of Vlad III is not that he became feared. Fear was armor he built from necessity, forged in the same fires that consumed his father and his brother, tempered by every betrayal that followed. The tragedy is that the armor never came off. It could not come off. A man who learns as a child that trust is a death sentence does not simply unlearn that lesson because the throne is finally secure. He carries the cell with him into every room he ever enters again, for the rest of his life, and eventually, everyone around him begins to look like a jailer. History remembers the stakes. History remembers the forest. It remembers a name twisted by a novelist who likely knew only fragments of the true story, transformed into a vampire who feeds on blood in the dark, an image so powerful it has nearly erased the actual man beneath it, the hostage, the exile, the prince who once made an empire turn back at the edge of a nightmare he built with his own hands. But perhaps the more haunting story is not the legend at all. Perhaps it is simply this: that oaths sworn by fathers, by kings, by empires, by God himself, meant nothing in that century, in that place, to the men who held real power. That a child paid the price for adult ambition and grew into an adult who made an entire nation pay that same price in return. That the line between the hostage and the horror he becomes is thinner and more easily crossed than any of us would like to believe. Somewhere in an unmarked grave, or perhaps in no grave at all, the truth of what remains of Vlad III has been lost to time, the way so many truths eventually are. But the lesson of the boy in the cell does not require a body to remain true. Power without trust becomes a cage, and the men who build their thrones from fear alone should remember, always, what waits at the end of every empire that ruled the same way before them. The silence after the fear fades, and no one left standing close enough to mourn.